Our present society is undergoing birthing pains, and until the baby comes out, things will continue to get worse and worse. And these birthing pains are the birth of the realization that we are gods made in the images of the Most High Creator God, and that we are now capable of articulating and making use of that fact through mathematical and linguistic precision that has rendered the entire world at our fingertips. Also, I got this cool bandana. It was like $10. It's like $10, and I just had to because I have had that tattoo for 7 years. No, 8 years now. 8, almost 9 years now. So I thought it was so cool. And one of them even looks like Avatar The Last Airbender. So yeah. It just looks really cool. And like, I don't know, there's a lot of times where like a bandana could be a useful thing to have. I'm gonna fold it back up now. So I just wanna, like, what if I needed a flag? Like, I was in a scenario where I just needed a flag impromptu. That would be very helpful. I mean, if I just need a bandana, then it's like a really cool bandana to have. So I don't really anticipate like super needing a bandana. But you know, sometimes you need a bandana, and like when I need a bandana, that'll be the bandana I have, and it was $10. It's really cool. So, but I've realized though that this is beyond good and evil. We're doing aphorism. Yeah, we're doing aphorism 9. So, it's aphorism 9 of the Walter Kaufmann translation of Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. And Nietzsche in this, I believe, really articulates the fact that we are in labor. Like, that's what I would say Nietzsche does. I'm just getting sun on the porch. Like, this is so necessary. There's the reason there's a sun on my arm. It's, like, very necessary to get sun. But Nietzsche articulates the fact that we are in labor. He articulates the culture that is in labor. And really a race of people, whole people that are in labor. And he describes that in Beyond Good and Evil. So I'm watching people talking about healthcare crisis, scientific propaganda, problems in the Dutch government, all this stuff. And I'm thinking, like, I could make reaction videos to this. I could do all these things. I could add my reaction to another reaction to a video from the 80s in a courtroom, and I could do all of this. But really, I need to react to Beyond Good and Evil. Like, really, our whole culture is still reacting to Beyond Good and Evil. And I may be one of the few people, I say few, there's probably like 50 to 100,000 people who have realized that this guy articulated the problem. Like, he articulated the problem. Fundamentally. My wife is calling, but I'm just going to keep making the video. Maybe she'll walk over to the porch and say hi. Tell her I'm making a video. But basically, Nietzsche articulates the growing pains, the birthing pains of our society, the labor pains of our society. And I think that there's still only a few people, relatively speaking, who have realized this. This is why Nietzsche starts off by going after the old philosophers, going after old methods of philosophy. And all this fits into my commentary because this is all necessary to understand Beyond Good and Evil. And this is the only way I understand to convey my understanding, limited as it is, of Beyond Good and Evil. It's a monumental accomplishment. Like, this book is an insane accomplishment. The fact that he could write this book, like this book, which is a reference to Rumi's statement, there's a field beyond good and evil, and there I will meet you. He's reconciled the mystic poets with the philosophers through Rumi. And if you don't understand the significance of that, then you haven't read much philosophy, because Plato starts off the Republic by banishing all of the poets and the artists because they're liars, because they say things that aren't objectively true. Like, they'll say, like, there was a duck that was talking. It's like, ducks don't talk, therefore they are objectively liars, and because they're saying things that aren't true, we need to ban them, because they're going to manipulate people into basing decisions on untruth and emotion. And this will, exactly what we're having right now in our culture, this battle between aesthetic values. And I mean, you could get into dang, my wife's calling me again. I can see it on my phone. I should probably put my phone on airplane mode before I make videos. I used to do that. I gotta call her back and then edit this into one video. It's just gonna take way more time, but like, screw it. That's the sacrifice of being married, I guess. So all was well, and she told me to put my phone on do not disturb, which it's on airplane mode because her calls get through do not disturb, and now I feel like I'm sharing too much operational data on how I operate. Security breach. Beyond Good and Evil, though, it's a tremendous accomplishment that Nietzsche was able to write this and reconcile. And he ultimately went crazy, I feel like, because I think the vital element of Europe that was necessary for the cultural transformation that Nietzsche first saw had already left for the American continent. That's what's happening, baby. The United States of America is giving birth to the vision foreseen by Nietzsche and Beyond Good and Evil, which was made possible and inevitable by the incarnation of God. That's literally what it is. And I'm not even being poetic, because Nietzsche reconciled poetry and philosophy. Oh, I could talk about this forever. Well, I'm ultimately challenging myself. I mean, I'm an industrialist, so I got supplements to create, I have formulations to do, I have research to do, I have formulations, not so much, I got the formulations down, but I have research to do on new potential formulations. Like, I got actual other work to do besides sit and talk about Beyond Good and Evil, but in some weird way, me talking about Beyond Good and Evil is actually a reconciliation of industry and science at the same time. Like, there's this interesting convalescence of meaning that I've discovered that I'm making use of through different video series, like the World Domination video series that's on my YouTube channel, like the Odysseus, which was a reference. Like, I do a little bit more abstract of a reference, and no one gets it. So then I'm just like, okay, I'm just going to do World Domination. Excuse me, and start the counter all over again, because World Domination is a much more... It's more powerful. Like, ultimately, if I'm just talking about world domination, I'm making that the title of my video series, then people are going to respond to that in a different way than anything else. And the mere fact that I can make these claims and then rationally back them up, like at some point, people will have to, like, the ideas, because they're rational, will catch on. This is what Nietzsche talks about Napoleon in Beyond Good and Evil. He talks about these figures and why they become inevitable in society. And as part of my active philosophy, I am an agent of bringing this about, not even by my own will, but simply by the fact that I developed fatal insomnia, the disease they call fatal insomnia. It's Devon's disease, really, fundamentally. I'm gonna refer to it as such and put out all necessary documentation and articles now that I'm healthier and getting even healthier, because like I've had this illness for like the last, I mean, really like my whole life I've been kind of ill from this, but then like it got worse 12 years ago, and then I've just been like battling to stay alive with like incredibly high points where I'm just like in peak physical condition, I get everything going, and then incredibly low points where I'm just dying and like I can't do anything, I can barely get videos out. And I documented that this time around because it happened 3 times. I've had these sorts of episodes. So I documented the last episode on my YouTube channel because I just like, I don't ever want to feel that way again. So I just want to have that documentation there just so people can see, oh yeah, like this is what Devon's talking about when he talks about these episodes, because no one else is talking about these things. So it's like, what do you mean? And it's like, I don't even know what I mean because I'm not sleeping during these periods. So it's like hard for me to describe in like the first person of what it's like, because like I don't feel like the guy who was going through that anymore, which is weird because I don't feel like the person who experienced a lot of my life, because like that guy's like a different guy. Like that guy is only sleeping 2 hours a week. Like that's a fundamentally different, not like fundamentally different, but like that guy is so different. Like I'll put it this way, like all of the time he feels like 99.999% of the time he feels differently and acts differently than I do right now. And it's like even just in micro moments of like, because in every point that guy's acting from like pain and horror and suffering, and I'm not acting from that. Like I feel fine, so I'm just like I'm good. Nice. I'm gonna talk about Beyond Good and Evil. Okay, interesting. And then there's this other state, and this is all necessary to the philosophy, because like you philosophize. This is what Nietzsche talks about. You philosophize from, and this is pulling on Aphorism 6, and I talk about this in Aphorism 6, my Aphorism 6 video. Like, I think that I'm one of the agents Nietzsche speaks about in Beyond Good and Evil, which is one of the reasons I'm talking about it, because I think it's necessary for people to understand Beyond Good and Evil. It's simply interesting that I think that, and that I have a coherent and articulable philosophy of why it is plausible that I may be one of the agents that Nietzsche was speaking of in Beyond Good and Evil. And so I'm talking about it. I don't know, call it therapy, call it whatever you will, but I think that the active articulation of this idea through the lived medium of my life creates the very philosophical wave of which Nietzsche spoke, which is in fact why Nietzsche is so important, because Nietzsche reconciles these fundamentally seemingly opposing forces into these waves of psychic energy that move across time. And Nietzsche himself lost his mind. Like, really read about Nietzsche's life. Like, he really lost his mind in health. I think he probably had autoimmune problems. It sounds like he has some degree of autoimmunity. And I think the combination of that, which is interesting to me because I'm like, I definitely have autoimmunity. So it's interesting that Nietzsche also had autoimmunity and mental health problems that resulted from autoimmunity, but also those coalesced into an irreconcilable philosophy. And I believe the reason it was irreconcilable is that the vital element of Europe again had left the European continent for the Americas, and that's why German philosophy was different from American philosophy because, or rest of European philosophy, because Germany as a country is younger than the United States of America. And Germany, like, basically, to my understanding, this is probably very limited, but there's probably enough truth in it that it works. The regions of Europe that became the later country of Germany and its surrounding political substructures and superstructures, which made it possible for those people to exist and think and speak the way they did, was those who wish. It was the same independent or a similar independent urge to the urge that motivated people. Because the Germans, if you read Grimm's fairy tales, were fundamentally, like, they lived in cabins in the woods. Like, these were people that wanted to be independent, and there were a bunch of small kingdoms all living near each other because these people fundamentally wanted to be independent. So there'd be individuals, family units, kingdom family units, fishermen, etc., like people living around this region that was less politically structured than the rest of Europe for motivational reasons similar to the reasons why the colonists went to America. So ultimately, you have this dividing of psychic energy between these two places, creating a three-tiered system. There were those who were wealthy enough they didn't want things to change, those who wanted things to change but didn't want to leave the continent, and then those who wanted things to change and were ultimately willing to leave their country or the continent to varying degrees depending on circumstance. So there's some overlap between those, but what that creates is a division of the transformative psychic energy of society between the less inhabited regions of Europe, like the Black Forest, and the American continents, so that when Nietzsche speaks of the transformative psychic energy of a society and whether society can will or not, he's missing this one facet, which is that a society's forces must be unified in order to will, and that it's like sand flowing into different regions of the hourglass. So Europe fundamentally, and this is like Europe itself and Asia are comprised of those who've left Africa, and Europe is comprised of those who have left Asia and Africa. So ultimately, Europe itself is a distillation. The Western civilization itself is a distillation of Africa and the Orient. So therefore, the thought behind Western civilization, which differentiates it from Oriental philosophy or whatever's going on in Africa, is fundamentally found in the transformative element of that society, which is the element of the society motivated to leave, which is why the West did the majority of the colonizing and not Asia. Like, Asia did not colonize the West more colonized Asia, simply, and this is, again, we'll get to this later in Nietzsche, to do with different modes of thinking that are more or less prevalent on these continents. And that's just simply a byproduct of humans over time. It's the way you have a slightly different culture on the West Coast of the United States versus the East Coast. There's a slightly different culture in the western side of the Eurasian African landmass than in the east of the Eurasian African landmass, and then in the African landmass, which is the starting point. It's like a TLC, like you're running thin layer chromatography, where compounds run to different points in the solute, I want to say. That could be the incorrect term. Based on their own properties and proclivities. For instance, Homo sapiens were the only hominid group that were said to travel, I believe. The rest of them all stayed in one place. Not every group exhibits the same psychic characteristics, which could be why those other hominid groups ended up going extinct. But basically, all of this comes together in Beyond Good and Evil, and in this philosophy of articulated living and dying and talking about these transformative psychic energies over time that Nietzsche engages in through this interesting book, and that our entire culture has been engaging in through many hundreds of thousands of years of people talking to each other and living, creating many dialectics. And as it appears to me, there's the tribal dialectic, which is the dialectic of Africa. There's the cultural supremacy dialectic, which is the dialectic of the Orient. This may actually be a more effective form of meditation for me than Eastern meditations. As they say, in the East, people need to train their minds to be quiet, whereas in the West, they must train their minds to express things, simply because of the orientation of the mind in the East versus in the West. The West being more individual and looking out, and the East being more culture looking in. So, in some sense, this is more of a Western style of meditation in some sense, and a silent meditation be more of an Eastern style of meditation. But as you can see, the fact that speaking of this topic allows me to just unite all of these different topics into one coherent narrative is not a byproduct of my own brilliance, but it is a byproduct of the fact that Nietzsche and myself have both stumbled onto this common thread that ties Western civilization to the Orient, to Africa, and unites all of humanity in one quest of mental inquiry that Nietzsche himself speaks of sometimes as Will to Power, though I don't like the book Will to Power because that was not written by him but by his sister, comprised of his notes. Though Nietzsche's specific ideas on Will to Power were different than most people think, because Will to Power is one of his most popular books, but it wasn't even authored by him. It was authored by his sister and published after his death. And this is ultimately the stumbling block that Nietzsche got caught up upon, because he lacked the ability to articulate the playful ideal of the child, which is what Christ speaks of when he says no one comes to the kingdom of heaven unless no one will enter the kingdom of heaven unless he enters like a child, but is also tied to the Mycenaean Odyssey. And honestly, let's just say psilocybin. Psilocybin makes your brain more childlike, and the Mycenaeans were doing a lot of psilocybin. And that's some neuroscience right there. So that I will be getting into and do get into in other videos. But basically, in this manner of playfulness and exploration, Christ himself unites philosophy and poetry and all things unto himself, and Nietzsche recognizes that we live in the land of the dead and are giving birth to a living baby that will rescue us from our own decomposition. And hence, sitting in the sun, we engage in sun worship, as it is the son who redeems the father from the land of the dead. Like Horus saves Osiris. The son resurrects all humanity. Like the son, Jesus, the son of man, saves man. But also by the son doing what the son sees the father doing. And then there's this whole relationship that's explored throughout the Bible of father-son relationships, our relationship to God as being a father-son relationship. Someone said God has no grandchildren, only children. I think that's Richard Rohr in his book Falling Upward. And this is an interesting observation because it speaks to the necessity of finding God yourself, which is something that religious institutions are almost categorically opposed to. Like Jung, who's a student of Nietzsche, said religious institutions were created to prevent people from having religious experiences. And I believe that he was telling the truth when he said that, which creates a very interesting scenario, because that dichotomy is, I believe that is the labor pains of which we must give birth to a new way of living, or more so recognizing that we are already living in a new way and articulating ourselves as such. It's interesting. It's interesting. I wouldn't believe, the skeptic in me wouldn't believe that there was a new way of being if God himself hadn't come down and died to tell me so. And that's why I have to sit in the sun and articulate my thoughts in a meditative way, because otherwise I would succumb to the almost death-like default mode network and simply pull all of my reality from society's default mode network instead of being creative and seeing through the patterns, as wrestling teaches us, and probably as the reason why Jacob wrestled with God. This philosophy of the body, which is deeper than any philosophy of man, spoken of in Beyond Good and Evil. You see, it just all comes together, and this is why I have to make videos in this way, to convey this, because it's really just it's too deep. I mean, I don't even know how I'm going to complete this, because I'm only on Aphorism 9. I haven't even gotten to Aphorism 9. I'm already at such a level of and there's like 300 aphorisms or something. Let me see. 296 aphorisms. So holy cow. I mean, this is really, like, this is why I say this is a labor. I mean, this is something that needs to be labored out, because this is crazy. Okay, so Aphorism 9. According to nature you want to live, O you noble Stoics, what deceptive words these are. Imagine being like nature, wasteful beyond measure, indifferent beyond measure, without purposes and consideration, without mercy and justice, fertile and desolate and uncertain at the same time. Imagine indifference itself as a power. How could you live according to this indifference? Living, is that not precisely wanting to be other than this nature? Is not living estimating, preferring, being unjust, being limited, wanting to be different? And supposing your imperative, live according to nature, meant at bottom as much as live according to life? How could you not do that? Why make a principle of what you yourself are and must be? In truth, the matter is altogether different. While you pretend rapturously to read the canon of your law and nature, you want something opposite, you strange actors and self-deceivers. Your pride wants to impose your morality, your ideal on nature, even on nature, and incorporate them in her. You demand that she should be nature according to the Stoa, and that you would like all existence to exist only after your own image, as an immense external glorification and generalization of Stoicism. For all your love of truth, you have forced yourselves so long, so persistently, so rigidly, hypnotically, to see nature the wrong way, namely stoically, that you are no longer able to see her differently. And some abysmal arrogance finally still inspires you with the insane hope that because you know how to tyrannize yourselves, stoicism is self-tyranny, nature too lets herself be tyrannized. Is not the Stoic a piece of nature? But this is an ancient eternal story. What formerly happened with the Stoics still happens today, too. As soon as any philosophy begins to believe in itself, it always creates the world in its own image. It cannot do otherwise. Philosophy is this tyrannical drive itself, the most spiritual will to power, to the creation of the world, to the causa prima, the first cause. According to nature you want to live, O you noble Stoics, what deceptive words these are. Imagine being like nature, wasteful beyond measure, indifferent beyond measure, without purposes and consideration, without mercy and justice, fertile and desolate and uncertain at the same time. Imagine indifference itself as a power. How could you live according to this indifference? Living, is that not precisely wanting to be other than this nature? Is not living, estimating, preferring, being unjust, being limited, wanting to be different, and opposing your imperative, live according to nature, meant at bottom as much as live according to life? How could you not do that? Why make a principle of what you yourself are and must be? So, according to nature, you want to live. So basically, like, this is just, he turns everything on its head, or he recognizes that things have already been turned on their heads, and then he begins this insane process by which every sentence dismantles every previous sentence in all of philosophy. And it's something. So when you kind of gotten to the bottom of a lot of philosophy, there's this idea that almost permeates everything, that we should live according to nature. Sort of like makes sense, it's like this fundamental idea of Orientalism. It's like as above, so below. That's Kabbalistic, but Kabbalistic and Orientalism are sort of similar, because it's this attempt to reconcile the universe without without Jesus Christ as the image of, as God himself, without, like, literally trying to reconcile the universe without Jesus Christ as God himself is impossible. Without creating a limited philosophy, which is why God himself had to become man. And this philosophical spirit of Christian inquiry that I am reciting to you right now is the very same spirit of inquiry that was inculcated in Europe for almost 2,000 years after the Incarnation, and 1,500 years after the adoption of Christianity as the official religion of Rome through Constantinople and the Byzantines, who were just the Romans, but we call them the Byzantines for some reason. And which is, again, super fascinating, because, again, you have the Byzantines building their center of the world at the previous center of the world, Troy, which is destroyed by the Mycenaeans, so that the Mycenaeans' conflict with the Trojans mirrors the Christians' conflict with Roman philosophy, of which the Christianized language adoption of Roman philosophy has become this limited stoicism, of which Nietzsche dismantles right now in these few short sentences. Which is why it's going to take me so long to unpack. Whatever. Like, I'm not even going to focus on that. I'm just going to get it done, Like, this is just nickels and dimes in the bank, and I'm just meditating in the sunlight, and it's okay, and this isn't that big of a deal. Whew, just got to calm myself down. This is the philosophy of the future right here. So imagine being like nature, wasteful beyond measure, indifferent beyond measure, without purposes and consideration. So he's describing a different perspective on nature, like all the trees, the leaves rotting, like this vast everything eating everything else and everything dying, which does produce all life, but is itself this process of death. So he's talking about nature almost as death, and that striving against nature is what life itself is, which is, again, another form of dichotomy. Again, you can express almost all philosophies as some version of the yin and the yang, which is why the image is so powerful. So here, you want to live according to nature, create the dichotomy of man versus nature, and say man is different from nature, but when man is like nature, then all is good, basically. Nietzsche just says, oh, you want to be like nature? Well, nature is comprised of death and life. and the death of nature is tremendous, and the life of nature is constantly fighting against the death of nature. So how could you even want to be something like that dichotomy? And in this, he's doing a bit of a linguistic shift because he's moving away from the unconscious presupposition that man is the center of the universe, that the unstated word, because to say you want to be like nature, there's the stated nature, but that implies the unstated man to which nature is being compared. Right now, I'm just speaking, assuming that there's going to be like 3 people that actually watch this entire thing wanting to understand what I'm saying. So I'd rather be complete in my conveyance than reach the maximum number of people, because this is already such a niche thing as it is, that it's like, who's going to even want, well, like, you know what I mean? Like going through Nietzsche aphorism by aphorism. Like, okay, it's a niche audience that are going to be interested. So I'm going to make these videos for a niche audience, because you can see, if you think of Christian philosophy as a reduction to the idea, which is false still, but it's a useful way to think about it, a reduction to the idea that the image of man is necessary to understand anything, then you'll understand that saying you want to be like nature is unconsciously inserting the image of man into a dualistic dialectic, by which we discuss nature and man and their supposed similarities and differences. And by doing that, it's like sewing. We sew the world together through the warp and the woof, as Alan Watts talks about. And that is why everything contains itself and its opposite, because language itself is this interposing oppositional idiomatic structure by which we reference meaning through shared experiences had through the human body, because we're all human beings. And in so doing, articulating this philosophy circumvents Wittgenstein's statement, whereof what one cannot speak, one must remain silent, by speaking of language the way we can. But still, I mean, that is necessary to not speak of what you cannot speak of. But so much of the inability to speak of things comes from the fact that our words do not incorporate their own origin through the understanding of the philosophy that Nietzsche is articulating and pointing to here, because he's really like the finger pointing at the moon, which is not the moon itself, but points to the moon. And so we must pay attention at the direction in which his philosophy is pointing and not necessarily what he is saying, because even in this aphorism which I have just read, he says that every philosophy basically becomes dead when it starts to believe in itself, because it's like the finger believing in the finger, when the finger was merely meant to point at the moon. And if you want to make sense of all of this, go listen to a bunch of Alan Watts and then come back to me, and you'll see how I'm reconciling Alan Watts with the incarnation of God and Nietzsche at the same time, which is really what they're all meant to do, because Alan Watts is going to be remembered as a Christian saint and monk, because it's basically what he was. Because I first heard about St. Athanasius, his statement, God became man so that man might become God, through Alan Watts, because Alan Watts is fundamentally just inquiring into the same sort of structures that I'm inquiring into. So Nietzsche points out this idea that he basically points out to us that we have limited our articulation of the world to a false dichotomy created for the convenience of educating children. Yeah. Living, is that not precisely wanting to be other than this nature? Is not living estimating, preferring, being unjust, being limited, wanting to be different, and supposing your imperative live according to nature meant at bottom as much as live according to life? How could you not do that? Why make a principle of what you yourself are and must be? So he's saying that he's basically dismantling Taoism, or at least simple conceptions of Taoism, like, oh, just go with the flow. It's like, but life itself is this not going with the flow, which does at a higher level go with the flow. But to reduce the lower level operations to the higher level operation is fundamentally to miss the point and to presuppose that there already exists a structure for reconciling these things, which is what I believe the West fundamentally is to the Orient. I believe that Western civilization reconciles the ideas that the Orient incorporates ages and ages later, and that ultimately human beings themselves comprise of some strange sort of, not computational device, but some strange computational dance across time that like bees dancing to communicate where the honey is. It's like we kind of do this dance, and now YouTube's a part of this dance, and books are a part of this dance, which creates this inevitable move towards what people call the singularity, which I don't think they understand, because I think that God is singularity and multiplicity. And no, I'm not going to unpack that right now, because this is already going to be a 45-minute long video, and I'm still on the first paragraph of Aphorism 9. And it's like, for me to even get through all of this is like, I may come back to these aphorisms and then elaborate on the aphorisms. I don't even know what I'm going to do after this. I mean, there's so much to do intellectually, given the new access to information, the ability to disseminate it, that I feel like I've been given intellectual steroids. Like, I just feel like there's no limit to what I can accomplish mentally, given my ability to read and understand and live my philosophy. So now I just want to, like, I don't know. I mean, this is even part of it. It just gets, I don't know what the result of me doing this is going to be, for myself or for the world, but it's this childlike spirit of play, which is itself the solution to this problem of living, is, how do we be like nature and not be like death? By being like children and playing. And there's neuroscientific reasons for that, because the play circuit is one of the most effective circuits in the brain itself. And I've got to go make archery videos. Got to go make some more of those. And that's even a meditation, because I'm going to force myself to articulate my whole philosophy of life almost through these repetitive videos, such that it creates a situation whereby I force people to talk about the themes in Beyond Good and Evil, because they're just beneath the surface. It's like literally like giving birth. It's like our society just needs to like look at these ideas in an articulated way. And I think that, like giving birth, it's better to do that voluntarily rather than just die in labor, because I think that the mother and the baby can both be saved. So ultimately, and the baby's got to come out, the baby can't grow up in there. So that is, you want to live according to this indifference. Living, is that not precisely wanting to be other than this nature? Is not living estimating, preferring, being unjust, being limited, wanting to be different? Supposing your imperative, live according to nature, meant at bottom, live according to life, how could you not do that? And again, he's saying, why say live according to nature if you do not mean live according to life? Because you're already inevitably doing that, because you're a living thing. Why make a principle out of what you yourself are and must be? Why make a principle out of what you yourself are and must be? Why not simply be? And so that's almost like asking, why not play? They're the same question. In truth, the matter is altogether different. While you pretend rapturously to lead the canon of your law in nature, you want something opposite, you strange actors and self-deceivers. Your pride wants to impose your morality, your ideal, on nature, even on nature, and incorporate them in her. You demand that she should be nature according to the Stoa. So he's now saying, you're pretending to read your own ideal in the world and then call it a law of reality, but in reality, what you're doing is you have a preconceived idea of what life should be, which is the Stoic philosophy, which I believe also to be the philosophy of Egypt, because it's almost like this death worship that creates civilization, which is why we all have gravestones everywhere, and where you don't see gravestones, you don't see civilization, because you must sacrifice your life to civilization and see your life in civilization in order to make decisions in the sort of way that creates things, which is to say that the real play of life requires a sort of seriousness that until now language has not been able to reconcile, which creates an almost, as Nietzsche points out, stoic death cult, which becomes the worshipped ideal and then is imposed on nature. And then Nietzsche says, even on nature, it's like, oh, it's indecent. It's like a form of rape that we would impose our ideal on even nature itself, instead of allowing nature to be nature, and demand that she be nature according to the Stoa, demand that we see only in nature that which we wish to see in ourselves. Existence to exist after your own image is immense external glorification, generalization of Stoicism. But which he's saying, it's like, if you just go into Stoicism at all, like, you need to be a kind of psycho nerd in order to understand what I'm talking about here, because he's talking, like, Nietzsche himself was a psycho nerd. So, which is interesting again too, because Nietzsche was very sick and Plato was very strong, and Nietzsche criticized Plato a good deal, which is, there's so much going on here. We're going to get to all that, and it's going to be very fun. For all your love of truth, you have forced yourself so long, so persistently, so rigidly, hypnotically to see nature the wrong way, namely stoically, that you are no longer able to see her differently. And by some abysmal arrogance finally still inspires you with the insane hope that because you know how to tyrannize yourselves, Stoicism is self-tyranny, nature too lets herself be tyrannized. Is not the Stoic a piece of nature? So here I immediately see Dionysus, who is the irrepressible aspect of nature that does not allow itself, which is in man, as man comes from nature, which does not allow itself to be tyrannized. And that same spirit of Dionysus seems to be the Hebrews leaving Egypt. It seems to be Egypt was not able to incorporate it. Greece's conflict with Dionysian cults. Rome's conflict with Dionysian cults. And a lot of the immortality key stuff that's gotten to in Brian Morikatsu, and a lot of this origins of religion as the recapturing of the spirit of shamanic ecstasy seems to be tied into this irrepressible aspect of nature. And again, the self-tyranny. It's like the shaman represents that the shaman was often both male and female in like weird ways, often involving castration, which I'm not recommending. Like, but a lot of, like, Camille Paglia talks about this in, like, Sexual Personae, and, like, how sexual personae are tied into our conceptions of ourself and our conceptions of nature, and how civilizations exist on and by incorporating these sexual personae into the civilization and into the mythology, and that it's like there's this, Elliot Hulse made a series of videos. You look into Elliot Hulse's stuff where he talked about like Jesus being in many ways very feminine, and there being this need to reconcile masculinity and femininity. Even Adam and Eve, like Eve comes out of Adam. Stoicism is very much this like hyper masculine, which is necessary, but it's like, again, as Nietzsche points out, it's this form of self-tyranny which is necessary. Like, I fight, I love fighting, like that's like my sport of choice, and as like you, as someone who fights for sport, you need to be very disciplined. Like, you need stoicism because it is brutal and you can get injured, and it's like definitely stoicism, like everything rides on the back of stoicism. But also stoicism itself is sort of it loses the spirit of play unless certain mental steps are taken, because extrapolations of Stoicism become mental shackles in different parts of civilization and society as endeavors become quote unquote serious rather than sincere. And a lot of our current confusion around science has to do with misinterpretations around this very idea, like the spirit of play versus the spirit of science. And there's people who say, like, unless you have like 20 degrees and you've devoted your life to studying one enzymatic reaction in a subspecies of E. coli, you're not a real scientist. And then there are people who say, in fact, doing that cripples your mind, and that you should really investigate everything and be rigorous, but you should pursue intuitive science in some sense. There are people who say intuitive science is blasphemy, trust the science. Like, trust the science. Like, where do you get that? Like, that's from this idea of Stoicism applied to the very creative process that the corrupted ideal of Stoicism makes impossible. Because when the play circuit is deactivated, your reticular activation system can't notice anything. And then we get back to the Mycenaean Greeks, who spoke about Hermes appearing as a flash of gold in the corner of your eye for a moment, which is the same as the alchemical winged Mercurius, which is the same as the psychological transformations described by the alchemists as per Carl Jung, which is the reconciliation of the material and the philosophical, which allowed us to create modern mathematical systems, which allowed us to describe the world to sufficient degrees that created all of modern chemistry, modern physics, which has elevated human beings undeniably to the level of gods, even more so than we already were, which, as Christ says in the Gospel of John, "Did you not know ye are gods?" Which is precisely what the incarnation of God makes possible, because until you really understand that man is the center of reality and take the logos, the problem of the divine logos seriously, you can't create the divine language that makes scientific conquest of the world possible, which is why we're now at the point where this self-defeating Stoicism is cutting off the base of it's the snake cutting off its own tail. It's like an Ouroboros, almost a snake eating itself, not knowing that it's got its own end. It's just, and again, that's why it's the symbol of my company. Weak to warrior. That's why that's the logo, is because this is an eternal pattern, which is what Nietzsche speaks of in the eternal recurrence, which is more Nietzschean. And again, I could like limit myself to sounding like, you can see why Nietzsche went crazy. By the grace of God, I will not go crazy doing this, but you can see why he went crazy. I mean, he's reconciling so many things at the same time, pulling the spirit of Atlantis back through the depths of ancient Egypt to reconcile him with Jesus Christ and give birth to modern deities. That's why I think it's one of the most important things for me to go through this, because I don't think anyone's actually gone through Beyond Good and Evil aphorism by aphorism in the way that I'm doing it right now on YouTube. Maybe it'll change the world. Who knows? But again, we need the example of Jesus Christ in order to reconcile nature within man. Otherwise, we end up with self-castrating shamans. Okay. So, but this is an ancient eternal story. What formerly happened with the Stoics still happens today, too. As soon as any philosophy begins to believe in itself, it always creates the world in its own image. It cannot do otherwise. Philosophy is this tyrannical drive itself, the most spiritual will to power, the creation of the world, to the causa prima. Yeah. Well said, Nietzsche.